Hello and welcome back for another notes video. I'm sorry in advance, this one is going to be longer than normal because we are covering presidents and presidents throughout the 50s and 60s in this notes video. So our first one is Harry Truman. I'm just going to jump right in because we got a lot to cover. So Harry Truman is president. He takes the presidency after FDR dies in the spring of 1945. And basically, Harry Truman's big challenge is reconversion. So after World War II is over, the American society has to switch from wartime effort to peacetime. And that falls on Harry Truman to orchestrate as he is the president of the United States. So reconversion just means the social and economic conversion from wartime to peacetime. So basically the transition in the society. So by 1946, we have 4.6 million workers who are striking for better wages and conditions because all these soldiers are coming back from World War II and getting their old manufacturing industry jobs back. And they're not happy with how they're being treated. So auto, steel, coal, electrical, and railroad industries are all trying to strike for better wages and working conditions. So Congress tries to pass the Taft-Hartley Act, which basically restricts the powers of unions, generally speaking. So there were so many strikes between 1945 and 1946 that people got scared that unions were gaining too much power. They're scared of communism still, so they're afraid that unions are going to take over and have like a revolution in our society. So basically what the Taft-Hartley Act does is gets rid of closed shops, which means closed shops are businesses that are only hiring people who are in the union. So basically the Taft-Hartley Act allows people to have the choice between if they want to be union or not, and limits other things like making sure they don't pay money to federal campaigns and things like that. And this passes through the Congress. Congress passes it through to the president. Truman vetoes the Taft-Hartley Act because he doesn't believe in it, because he's all for fair wages and things like that. He's for laborers. So he vetoes it since it's anti-labor, and then Congress overrides that with a 2/3 vote. So it does pass into law. And the reason why it is able to pass into law is because Republicans are in charge of the Congress for the first time since the early 30s, and they are able to pass this through. Moving on to Eisenhower. So Truman does not seek re-election to the presidency in 1952. So instead, Dwight D. Eisenhower is pushed in to being the Republican nominee. And he was a military general during World War II. So people really like him because, we won World War II. So they're like, Eisenhower's the champion. He promises to fight Korea and communism and corruption in our society. So people really like that because we are afraid of communism in America since it goes against our democratic ideals. So Eisenhower is elected to presidency, but Congress returns to Democratic control. So not a ton happens during his presidency since he is Republican and Congress is Democratic. They kind of clash with ideas. But he does have this idea of modern republicanism, which takes root during this time period. And basically, he believes in slowing the growth of the federal government, limiting presidential power, increasing the authority of Congress and the courts, and he wants to cut spending, balance the budget, and reduce taxes. So people really respond to that and like they don't want to pay a ton of taxes. So same as today. All right, and then moving into the 1960s, we have JFK. So John F. Kennedy is inaugurated in 1961, and he's a very well-liked president. He famously says in one of his speeches, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." So he's kind of like a call to action kind of guy in the 1960s. And then he also targets tyranny, poverty, disease, and war as his main platform for being elected. And people really respond to that. They don't want to be under a tyrannical government. And there are a lot of people living in poverty at this point in time, so people really like this. And they don't want to go to war again because we just got out of World War II. So people during the 1960s, so we talked about conformity during the 1950s. During the 1960s, that starts getting challenged. So people are starting to question their parents' political views and attitudes, and they want to get out of the status quo loop, like adhering to the conformity of the time. They want to get rid of that. So JFK kind of represents hopes and aspirations for the future and trying to get rid of that status quo because he is such a young president. So a lot of people look to him as a way to change the status quo that we are used to. And this election was super close. It was between JFK and Richard Nixon. Nixon does eventually win the presidency, and he has also served as the vice president. So the 1960 election was JFK versus Nixon. It is super close, and it's the closest presidential election in history, and also the first presidential election where they televised the presidential debates. So that played a lot into why JFK was voted into office because Nixon was much older and he refused to wear makeup on TV. So it made him look even older and like washed out and not healthy like JFK looked because he was wearing makeup. So a lot of people who watched the debates on TV were swayed to vote for JFK just because of his youthful appearance. So Kennedy's general goals as president, he had three main things in mind. And then he also had a fourth thing that he accomplished while in office. So his first goal was to improve the economy. He just wanted to make sure the economy was booming. Second, he wanted to give aid to the poor, and he actually passed the Housing Act of 1961, pushed that through. And basically what that did was provide housing for moderate and low-income families. And it also promoted urban development. So if you recall in the previous notes, a lot of people were moving out to suburbs during this time period. So he wanted to make sure that our cities were still like livable and we had cool stuff in the cities so that some people would still want to live there. And then the Housing Act also helps disabled people and elderly people who maybe no longer have the income to afford proper housing anymore. And then his third goal was the space program. And this was basically like a race against the Russians, who are communists, so we wanted to defeat them. So he was concerned that the USSR, the Russians, had sent Sputnik in 1957 up to space and a man into space in 1961. So he was very concerned with getting us to be the first men on the moon. He really pours a lot of money into NASA, the space program. So in 1961, we have Alan B. Shepard orbits the Earth, and then July 20th, 1969, NASA does put Neil Armstrong on the moon. And then he also passes the 24th Amendment, which ends poll taxes. So mostly in the South, but also other places. because Black men now had the right to vote, people were charging Black men taxes at the polls so that they could limit the amount of Black men voting and things like that. So he ends poll taxes completely. So, spoiler alert, and I'm sorry if you didn't know this, but JFK is assassinated November 22nd, 1963, by Lee Harvey Oswald while he is campaigning in Texas. And so Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson has to take over as president. So Kennedy's legacy is continued through Johnson for the most part. So he also focuses on the economics, wants to grow our economy. He increased defense and NASA spending, billions of dollars go into urban renewal. He also starts programs like Kennedy started Head Start and the Peace Corps, which are different assistance programs for different groups of people. And Kennedy had also furthered our involvement in Vietnam, fighting those darn commies over there. And then our last thing before we're done is the Great Society. So Johnson, for the most part, continues Kennedy's legacy here because he thinks that's what the people want since they so strongly supported Kennedy. And even though he disagreed with some of those policies, he pushed through some of the social reforms that Kennedy had wanted as like kind of a gift to him in his death, I guess. And that becomes known as the Great Society. So Johnson's presidency becomes known as the Great Society. So basically, he focuses on civil rights and tax cuts, which people really support. Good job, Johnson. And then in 1964, people do appreciate the job that he's done. So he does win his own election into the presidency against Barry Goldwater. And for the most part, the Great Society was super popular. It raised social expectations for what the government was providing. But then people realized that it's not actually ending poverty completely. So people start to lose hope in the Great Society. And that is it for our presidents of the 1950s and 60s. Please join me next time to talk about social movements.